She fed his entire house for 4 months. He didn't learn her name until her chair was empty. It was a hard November in Yorkshire, in the year 1819, when a woman in a plain grey cloak walked up the servants' track to Ellsmere Hall and asked the housekeeper, without preamble or particulars, whether the kitchen wanted a cook. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, had buried 2 cooks to gin and 1 to a runaway marriage that autumn, and she did not trouble herself with references from a woman who plainly had none to give. She looked at the stranger's ungloved hands, chapped but clean, and her straight back, and the careful, exhausted dignity with which she held herself, and she made the only decision a practical woman makes in November with 40 people to feed. Can you cook a joint without ruining it and keep a kitchen from catching fire, and will you take your wages quiet and not go running off to marry the first groom who winks at you? I can, and I will not, and my wages you may set as you please, the woman said. I ask one thing only. I would rather you did not trouble His Grace with the particulars of who is cooking his supper. I have my reasons, and they harm no one. Mrs. Pruitt, who had reasons of her own for not asking too closely into any servant's past, shrugged and showed her the stove, and that was the whole of the interview by which Frances Aldridge came to spend the hardest winter of her life feeding the Duke of Ellesmere, and never once being seen by him at all. She was 24, the only surviving child of a Yorkshire gentleman who had gambled a comfortable inheritance down to nothing, and then, unable to face the wreck of it, had ridden his best horse into a flooded beck one black night and not come home. Frances had buried her father, sold what the creditors had not already claimed, and discovered in the space of a single dreadful month that a gentlewoman with no fortune and no husband has exactly 2 honest trades open to her, governess or servant, and that a governess is watched by an entire household while a cook may vanish into her own kitchen and be, at last, blessedly unseen. She had chosen the kitchen on purpose. She did not want to be looked at. She had spent her whole short life being looked at as the pretty Aldridge girl with the good prospects, and she had learned in one terrible month exactly how little that looking was worth once the prospects were gone. And she wanted, more than she wanted warmth or wages, simply not to be watched pretending to be something she no longer was. She got her wish for 4 months. That was the strange mercy and the strange cruelty of it both. Ellsmere Hall, that winter, was a house in mourning behind its ordinary business, though it had been 2 years since the old Duchess died, and the black had long come off the door. The Duke, Alexander Fenwick, was 36, a tall, spare, courteous man, whom the county considered the very picture of a well-run duke and privately the loneliest man in 3 ridings. Though no one said so to his face, because he had built, in the 2 years since his mother's death, a life of such faultless, orderly correctness that grief had nowhere left to show itself. He dined precisely at 7. He read his letters precisely at 9. He rode the home farm every morning regardless of weather, and he had not, since his mother died, sat down to a meal in his own house that tasted of anything at all. Not because the kitchen was poor, but because he had stopped noticing food the way a man stops noticing his own hands. And then, without his ever learning why, his suppers began, very quietly, to taste like something. He could not have said when it started. There was an evening in December when the ordinary mutton arrived dressed with a rosemary and red currant that struck some buried chord in him so hard he set down his fork and sat a long moment before he could go on. There was a barley soup in January, thick with winter herbs, that tasted so precisely, so uncannily like something out of his own childhood that he found himself, absurdly, blinking back a heat behind his eyes at his own solitary table, and had to ask the footman, gruffly, who had made it. The new cook, Your Grace, the footman said. Mrs. Pruitt hired her back in November. Her name I couldn't rightly say, Your Grace. She keeps to the kitchen. Doesn't mix with the rest of the staff overmuch. The Duke of Alexander Fenwick found this answer entirely satisfactory at the time, because he was not a man in the habit of troubling himself over the names of his cooks, and because a duke's whole education teaches him that the machinery of a great house runs best when he does not look too closely at its parts. He ate the soup. He did not ask again, but he found himself, in the weeks that followed, listening for the particular quality of the evenings when the food tasted of something. A currant sauce with a bitterness under the sweet that reminded him, precisely, of a walk his mother used to take him on through the kitchen garden. A plain bread with caraway that was, unaccountably, the exact bread of a childhood illness when his mother had sat up with him 3 nights running, and each time it happened he told himself it was chance, the way a lonely man tells himself a great many things, and each time he found he had eaten the whole of it and wanted more. He did not go down to his own kitchen. A duke did not go down to his own kitchen. It was not done, and Alexander Fenwick was a man for whom what was not done had, since his mother's death, become the entire architecture of his days, and so the woman who was slowly, without either of them intending it, feeding him his own grief back to him one careful dish at a time, remained to him a name he never asked and a face he never sought, for the whole of a long Yorkshire winter. Frances, in the kitchen, knew a great deal more of him than he knew of her, the way servants always do. She had learned from the scullery maids that the old Duchess had died 2 winters back of a wasting illness that had taken 8 slow months, and that the young Duke had sat with her every one of those months, and had not, by all household account, laughed since. She had learned that his aunt, Lady Verney, had lately taken up residence at the Hall with the settled intention of seeing him married before the year was out, and that the candidate pressed upon him with the greatest determination was a Lady Augusta Penhallow, a handsome, clever, well-connected woman of 27, who visited often and watched the household with a cold, assessing eye that Frances, from the kitchen door, had marked and mistrusted at once, and she had learned, without ever meaning to learn it, the shape of the Duke's grief from what the house told her of him, the mother he could not speak of, the recipes she had once kept in her own hand in a battered household book that no one in the kitchen now consulted, because no one now living could read the old Duchess's cramped, spiraling script. Frances could read it. She had found the book gathering dust on a high shelf her 2nd week in the kitchen, and she had spent an evening by candlelight puzzling out the old Duchess's hand purely from a cook's idle curiosity, and had found, tucked between its pages, a single loose card in a different, younger, more careful writing. Her own mother's writing, a recipe for a barley and winter herb soup, copied out years before in an exchange of receipts between 2 Yorkshire gentlewomen who had once, it seemed, been friends, old Lady Ellsmere and the young Mrs. Aldridge, a friendship 2 dead women had shared and their children had never known of. Frances had stood in the cold kitchen with her dead mother's hand in her fingers and the old Duchess's book open before her, and understood, with a strange lurch of the heart, that she was cooking, unknowingly and by pure inheritance, the very foods that had once passed between their 2 families before ruin and death had torn the connection apart. She made the soup. She told no one why, and she watched, from the kitchen door on the nights the footman carried it up, a strange fierce tenderness rise in her for a lonely man she had never once spoken to, because she alone in that whole great house knew exactly what she was quietly feeding him, and why it struck so deep, and she found she could not stop herself from doing it. There came, in late January, the one evening the whole careful distance between them very nearly failed to hold. The footman, who ordinarily carried up the supper trays, had gone down with a fever, and Mrs. Pruitt, harried past Patience by a dinner for the visiting Lady Verney, thrust the tray at Frances herself with an order to hurry, and there was no time to protest before Frances found herself climbing the back stair, with the Duke's own soup in her 2 hands, into the part of the house she had spent 4 months making entirely certain never to enter. She meant only to leave it with whichever footman she could find in the passage above. She found no one. The dining-room door stood ajar, the Duke seated alone at the long table with his letters pushed aside, and before she could retreat unseen, he had looked up. For one suspended moment, neither of them moved. Frances stood in the doorway with the tray trembling very slightly in her hands, in her plain kitchen apron, with flour still at her wrist, and the Duke of Ellesmere looked at the woman who had, for 2 months, been feeding him back to himself, without either of them knowing the other's face. And something in his tired grey eyes sharpened with an attention she had spent 4 months carefully avoiding. He did not ask her name. He only said, "Lo, you made the soup in December. The one with the red currant," and it was not quite a question. And Frances felt the whole of her careful invisibility come within a single sentence of ending forever. "I did, Your Grace," she said, and set the tray down with hands that did not entirely obey her, and turned to go before he could ask the question underneath the question. Before the 4 months of careful distance could close in one candlelit room, before a duke could look properly at a ruined gentlewoman playing at cook and see the whole of what she was hiding, she felt his gaze on her back the length of the doorway. He did not call her to stop. He let her go, out of what she would later understand was his own long habit of not reaching for things he might only lose again. And the door closed between them. And the almost of it, the whole conversation neither of them had, sat in that dining room like a held breath for a long time after she had gone. Before the season turned, and before the Duke of Ellesmere learned exactly what, and whom, he had been eating all winter, there passed a long stretch of quiet months in which an unseen woman fed a grieving man his own childhood back to him a spoonful at a time, and neither of them knew the other's face. If a story of 2 people drawn together by nothing louder than rosemary and barley is the kind that keeps you listening, stay a little longer. What came apart in February changed everything that came after. It was Lady Augusta Penhallow who first noticed what the Duke himself had not let himself see. She came to Ellesmere for a long visit in the new year, at Lady Verney's contriving, and she was neither foolish nor careless, and she watched her intended with the close attention of a woman who means to have him. She noticed that he ate with an appetite at Ellesmere he did not show at any other table in the county. She noticed the particular stillness that came over him after certain dishes, a private, unguarded softness she had never once seen in him at her own family's table, and being a clever woman, she made inquiries of her own maid, who made inquiries of the housemaids, and within a week Lady Augusta Penhallow had learned that the Duke's peculiar new contentment traced, with suspicious regularity, back to the kitchen, and to a quiet, well-spoken cook who kept herself apart from the rest of the staff and had, the housemaids whispered, uncommonly fine hands and manners for a woman who scoured pots. Lady Augusta did not confront the Duke. She was too clever for that. She went, instead, quietly to Mrs. Pruitt, and reminded the housekeeper, with a smile that did not reach her cold eyes, of certain irregularities she had noticed in the household accounts that a word to his Grace might make unpleasant for a woman nearing her pension, and she suggested, in the gentlest possible terms, that a cook with no references and a manner above her station was precisely the sort of ambiguous hire that reflected poorly on a housekeeper's judgment, and that it would be a kindness to everyone concerned if the woman were quietly let go before the Duke's coming birthday dinner, for which Lady Augusta herself meant to oversee the arrangements as the future mistress of the house. It was the first move Augusta Penhallow made against a woman she had never met, and it very nearly succeeded entirely without a struggle, because Mrs. Pruitt was frightened and old and had her own small irregularities to hide, and she came to the kitchen the next morning with a face like ash and told Frances, not unkindly, but not gently either, that her services would no longer be required after the week's end, and that she was to have her wages and go quietly, and that no character would be given, because none had been asked for at the start, and none, Mrs. Pruitt said, looking away, could safely be given now. Frances Aldridge stood very still in the kitchen that had been the one unwatched corner of her whole ruined life, and she understood at once, with the sharp clarity of a woman who has already lost everything once, exactly what was happening and why, and exactly how little power she had to fight it. She could have gone to the Duke. She could have walked up the back stair and knocked at his study door and told him plainly what his aunt's chosen bride had done to a blameless cook out of jealousy over a soup. She thought of it, standing in the cold kitchen with her dismissal in her hands, and she found, to her own surprise, that she did not want to. "I will go quietly," Frances said. "I asked to be unseen when I came, Mrs. Pruitt, and I find I would rather leave the same way. Tell His Grace, if he ever thinks to ask, that his cook left of her own will and owed this house nothing more than the debt of decent work honestly done. I will not beg to stay in a kitchen where I have already been judged unfit for reasons that have nothing to do with my cooking." She untied her apron for the last time. "I have been a woman other people decided things about my whole life, Mrs. Pruitt. My father decided I would have a fortune, and then he decided, riding into that beck, that I would not. I will not now let a woman I have never met decide that I am a scandal to be swept out with the ashes. I would rather choose my own leaving than be swept." She was gone before the dawn kitchen fires were lit the next morning, with her small trunk and her mother's recipe card, which she took, in the end, because it was the one thing in that house that had ever truly been hers to take. The Duke of Ellesmere came down to a cold breakfast 3 days before his birthday dinner and asked, out of nothing more than habit, whether the barley soup might be served that evening, since the weather had turned raw, and the footman, embarrassed, informed him that the cook who made it had left the hall's employ some days since, on Mrs. Pruitt's notice, and that a new woman had been engaged from the village. Something in Alexander Fenwick went suddenly, unaccountably cold. "Left," he said. "On whose authority?" "Mrs. Pruitt's, Your Grace. I believe, I could not say for certain, I believe Lady Augusta may have had some word with Mrs. Pruitt regarding the household accounts, and the cook's character not being on file." The Duke set down his coffee very carefully, the way a man sets down a thing he does not trust his hand to hold steadily, and for the first time in 2 years of faultless, ordered days. Alexander Fenwick did something entirely without precedent. He went down, himself unannounced, to his own kitchen, and stood in the doorway of the hot low room where he had never once in his life set foot, and demanded of Mrs. Pruitt the whole of it, the woman's name, her situation, where she had gone, and found, to his own considerable shock, that he did not know the answer to the first question himself, because in 4 months of eating that woman's grief and his own back and forth across a table she had never sat at, he had never once thought to ask. "Frances, Mrs. Pruitt said at last, wretched, cornered, "Frances Aldridge, Your Grace. I do not know where she has gone. I did not ask." Lady Augusta made it plain that she stopped herself, too late. Aldridge. The name struck something loose in him, a half-buried memory of his mother, years before, speaking fondly of a Yorkshire family, a friend from her girlhood, Aldridge, and a ruined gentleman who had drowned himself in a beck the autumn before last, whose name the county had murmured over for exactly 1 season, before moving on to other gossip, as counties do. The Duke of Ellesmere stood in his own kitchen with his whole ordered life coming apart in his hands, and understood, in the space of one terrible minute, that he had spent a winter being fed his mother's own recipes, copied out by his mother's own girlhood friend, by that friend's daughter, a gentlewoman, ruined and grieving exactly as he was grieving, who had cooked for him unseen and unnamed for 4 months because she had learned, as he had, that being looked at was its own kind of danger, and that his aunt's chosen bride had had her dismissed like a thief over nothing more than a jealous woman's suspicion, and he had not even known the woman's name to defend her. That night the Duke of Ellesmere did not sleep. He sat at his writing table with a single candle and wrote and tore up and wrote again 3 letters he had no address to send, because a man who has spent 2 years perfecting the art of not feeling anything discovers, when feeling finally arrives, that he has no practiced way to hold it. He thought of every evening the soup had come up warm and unremarked, of every silent debt of comfort he had never once acknowledged, because acknowledging it would have meant admitting he still had a mother to grieve and a heart left raw enough to be moved by rosemary. He thought of a woman alone in a kitchen, cooking her own dead mother's friendship back into a house that did not know her name, asking nothing, wanting nothing, and being thrown out over an accusation she had never been given the chance to answer. Somewhere near dawn, Alexander Fenwick understood, with the particular clarity that comes to a proud man only at the very end of his pride, that he had spent his whole life letting a great house run itself so smoothly around him that he had stopped noticing the people who ran it, and that the woman who had, without his knowledge, done more to ease his grief than any physician or aunt or well-connected bride in 2 years, had walked out of his life because he had never once thought to look at her, and he meant, before the sun was fully up, to spend whatever it cost him finding her and making that right. He did not wait for a private hour. His birthday dinner was 2 days off, the whole county already bidden, Lady Augusta already presiding over the menus and the flowers with the settled proprietary air of a woman who considers the matter closed, and Alexander Fenwick decided, standing in his cold kitchen with a dismissed cook's name finally in his mouth, that whatever he meant to say to Augusta Penhallow, he would say it in the same room where she had meant to crown herself his hostess, in front of the very guests she had been so careful to arrange. The dinner went forward as planned, 40 guests down 2 long tables under the Ellesmere plate, and Lady Augusta sat at the Duke's right hand in the place a future Duchess sits, glittering, certain, receiving the compliments on a menu she had chosen herself to replace the one the house had grown used to. It was over the second course that the Duke rose, unbidden, glass in hand, and the table quieted for what everyone assumed would be the pleasant nothing a birthday host says before the port. "I find I must correct something before this dinner goes further," Alexander said, and his voice, though quiet, carried the whole length of both tables. "Most of you will recall that this house fed remarkably well this past winter, better, I am told by more than one guest, than at any dinner in a decade. I did not know, until a fortnight ago, whose hands were behind that. She was a gentlewoman of this county, ruined by her father's debts and death, who took a cook's place here because the world offers a woman in her situation almost no other honest trade, and who asked this house for nothing beyond fair wages the whole winter through. She was dismissed 9 days ago, without a hearing, on a manufactured suspicion, and I have since learned exactly who manufactured it, and why." He did not look away from Augusta as the colour left her face. Lady Augusta believed a cook beneath her notice until she discovered that cook had given me back something 4 years of her own attentions had never managed to touch. She could not bear to be outdone by a bowl of soup, and so she went to my housekeeper and threatened a frightened old woman's pension, until an innocent servant was turned out into the cold, with no character and no warning. That is not a foible, Augusta, that is cruelty, dressed very carefully as propriety, and I will not sit at a table pretending I did not learn the whole of it. The room had gone entirely silent, the kind of silence a county remembers for a generation. Lady Verney's hand had gone to her throat. Augusta Penhallow, cornered in front of 40 witnesses she had meant to charm, tried the same weapon a second time, reaching, as such people do, for the only thing she had left. She is a servant, Alexander, whatever her father once was, Augusta said, low and furious, and you disgrace yourself and this house discussing her at your own table as though she were a lady born. I did what any sensible woman minding your interests would have done. She is the daughter of my mother's dearest girlhood friend, the Duke said, which you would have discovered in one honest conversation instead of one dishonest letter to my housekeeper. Had you ever once troubled to see her as a person, rather than a rival to be removed? I am not disgracing this house, Augusta. I am telling 40 of our neighbors the truth, before you can tell them a prettier version of it tomorrow. You will make your excuses to my aunt tonight. I find I have no wish to marry a woman who answers her own jealousy with another woman's ruin, and I mean, before this month is out, to go and find the one I ought to have been looking for all winter, and ask her name properly this time. It was, the county agreed for years after, the finest thing anyone had ever said over a Yorkshire dinner table, and it did more for the memory of Francis Aldridge in that room than any introduction ever could have. For by the time the port was poured, every soul at those 2 long tables understood exactly who had fed them so well all winter, and exactly what kind of man their Duke had turned out, at long last, to be. Finding her took the better part of a fortnight, for Francis Aldridge had gone to ground the way a proud woman goes to ground, taking a small room in York under her own name, but no forwarding word to anyone at Ellsmere, determined to begin again, unseen exactly as she had begun there. It was Mrs. Pruitt, wretched with guilt and grateful for the chance to mend it, who at last recalled the name of the York agency through which the new cook had once mentioned finding her position, and it was there, on a grey afternoon, with the last of the winter still in the air, that the Duke of Ellesmere found her, in a small hired room, mending her own one good gown by a thin fire, entirely unprepared to find a duke standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands like a suitor and not a lord. "You never asked my name," Francis said, when she had recovered enough to speak at all. "4 months, your grace. I fed your whole house, and you never once asked." "No," Alexander said, "I did not. I am here to tell you I have thought of nothing else since I learned it, and that not asking is the greatest failure of attention I have committed in my entire well-managed life, and I have come a very long way to correct it as thoroughly as I am able." He held out, in his open hand, the loose card he had found, tucked back into his mother's household book where Frances had left it, her mother's careful hand. The barley soup. The 2 old friendships tangled together across a generation and a ruin. "I know now what you were feeding me all winter, Frances. I know whose hand taught you the soup, and whose friendship it came from, and what it must have cost you to make it for a stranger who never once came down to thank you. I did not come to offer you your position back. I came because I find I cannot go on eating my own grief at another man's table for the rest of my life. When the woman who first showed me I still had a heart capable of tasting anything at all is sitting alone in a cold room in York, mending her own gown, because my aunt's chosen bride could not bear to be outdone by a soup." Frances set down her needle. Her hands, that had cooked and scoured and mended through the hardest winter of her life without once asking anything of anyone, were not quite steady now. "I did not cook for you to be found out, your grace," she said. "I cooked because it was the one honest work left to me, and because your mother's book fell open in my hands one cold night, and I could not, in conscience, let her recipes go to waste on a house that had forgotten how to read them. I never once wanted your notice. I am not sorry you have it now. But do not mistake gratitude for the thing it resembles, and do not come to a ruined woman's door out of guilt and call it something warmer than it is. It is not guilt, the Duke said, and here, at last, was the moment his whole long interior reckoning came to its point. For the man who had spent 2 years so carefully managing every feeling out of his own days, now stood in a cold rented room and let the last of that management fall away entirely. Guilt sent me looking. It is not what has kept me awake every night since. I have sat at my own table for 2 years tasting nothing, Francis, grieving in the particular silent way a duke is permitted to grieve, which is to say alone, and without company, and without ever once being allowed to say the thing plainly, and then, without my knowledge or my leave, a woman I never saw began setting my mother back in front of me a spoonful at a time, and I found, for the first time since she died, that I was capable of being moved by something again. I do not know how to make that gratitude. It felt, and feels now, a great deal more like being handed my own life back by a stranger who never once asked to be thanked for it. He held her gaze. I am not offering you a kitchen, Francis Aldridge. I am asking whether a woman who spent a whole winter feeding a lonely man his own heart back would consider spending the rest of her life letting him look at her while she does it. The kiss she gave him then, in the thin grey light of a hired room in York, was quiet and unhurried, and what broke open in Francis was the plain astonishment of being seen, truly seen, at last, after a whole winter of choosing to be invisible, because visibility had only ever cost her before, by the one man in England who had finally troubled to look past the soup to the woman who had made it. They were married that summer at Ellsmere, quietly, with old Lady Ellsmere's household book open on a table in the hall for any guest who cared to see the 2 hands, mothers and daughters, that had written half its recipes between them across a friendship that had outlasted both women's deaths. Lady Augusta Penhallow did not attend, having found, in the intervening months, a duller and more willing match elsewhere in the county. And the story that travelled after her, of a cold woman undone by a warm soup, proved, in the end, rather more durable than any she would have wished for herself. Frances never cooked at Ellsmere again, in the sense the county understood the word, but every year, on the anniversary of the old Duchess's death, she made the barley soup herself, in her own kitchen, with her own hands, and served it to her husband at their own table with no footman between them. And every year Alexander Fenwick set down his spoon at the first taste, and sat a long moment in the particular unguarded stillness of a man remembering, on purpose now, and gladly, instead of by accident, and half-starved for it. Their eldest daughter, born the following spring, was taught the recipe at 7 years old, standing on a stool at her mother's elbow, and told, plainly, the whole of where it came from, and why it mattered. That the best inheritance a family can hand down is not a fortune, which can be lost in a single ruinous season, but a plain honest thing made carefully, by hand, for someone you have decided to love, and that a duke who finally learned to ask a name discovered, in the asking, everything a great house had never once thought to teach him about paying proper attention to the people who kept it warm.